Welcome. My name is Ray Machado. I'm an associate risk control consultant with Alliant Insurance, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Emergency Management 301, Fundamentals of Emergency Management, Restoring Order. So there will be a Q&A session at the end of today's call, just for everyone's information, and you may submit questions at any time via the questions panel on the right side of your screen. If you don't see the panel, check the red arrow. Our presenter today is Charles Stewart. Charles has over 25 years of experience in risk and safety in both government and business management. He has a background in criminal and civil law, working in law enforcement as a probation officer and court administrator. As a national training instructor, he taught tribal legal programs and procedures for court and law enforcement. Charles is also well-versed in drafting tribal and local laws, codes, ordinances, policies, and procedures, and he holds a membership in the American Bar Association and American Planners Association. It is now my privilege to turn the program over to Chuck.
Thank you, Ray. When I look back at years back when I was working in city and county government and management, we did a lot of the planning aspects of community growth and future projections, and a lot of that happened to also bring in the emergency management side. When they look at municipality takes a look at some of that, it's important to integrate your emergency management system with your overall plans in your community. One can't really exist without the other. And so trying to develop those programs, the number of resources, depending on the size of the community, it is certainly a task that is very necessary and very important in the overall role when you start thinking about all the different fundamentals in emergency management. When you look at what emergency management is, you're trying to reduce the vulnerabilities and be able to cope with the disaster. And then, your first course of or priority is to reduce the loss of life before property. And then also to protect against any types of threats and hazards. Sometimes that feat or challenge is larger than what it really may be appear to be when you start looking at it on paper and you start bringing in all these different models. The one thing that I learned in past experiences with a number of disasters I've had to work with is we've spent a lot of time writing these plans in educating and training, and then a day of a crisis arrives, and the one item that did not know anything about our plans or review it or reacts according to how we drafted it was the disaster itself. No tornado ever reviews these plans. So when the plans are written, they have to be fluid and be able to transfer back and forward so that depending on the type of disaster, how it may hit, the strength, integrity, all of those come into play in the emergency management aspect. So when you're looking at that, they're always going to be there, and they're always going to have that huge impact on your environment as well as on your community. So it has to make sure that the emergency management plans are very fluid and they continue to be updated and regularly reviewed. And that's why we say it's important to make sure to integrate your plans into your overall community goals and community plans, future plans, and development. It's so important to be able to make sure that the emergency management remains part of the community, and that the community embraces the emergency management. And there's different ways to looking at that and how you might approach those. But it certainly also needs to be in the daily decisions, not just in the times of disaster. So when you're integrating these, you'll see a bigger picture. You start looking at the different models in the different areas and avenues, and how many moving pieces it takes in order to establish or put in these emergency plans. And many of these, when you start looking at them, there's a number of principles that kind of drive the overall emergency management. You start looking at these, and you're trying to build this disaster resistant and resilient community, and it gives you a good opportunity to strive for those. But when you're beginning to build these, and you start putting words on paper, you have to start doing things like the threat and hazard identification. Depending on your region, depending on your location, you want to be able to identify what kinds of natural and man-made threats might your community be faced with. And then from that, be able to develop your risk analysis and as well as an impact analysis. Depending on if you're in the Midwest area where you're probably more susceptible to tornadoes, you have a difference between a wind shear and a tornado. Then you have the difference between FF1s or the FF5s. So you have to look at the impacts of what that threat might be and how that might devastate or impact your particular community. And same thing with whether it's the fires out west or whether it's hurricanes in the south. That's why it's very important to be able to break down what type of natural disasters or man-made disasters will impact your community, and how are you going to respond to that. And that's where it really begins to get convoluted, very complex in the overall aspect of emergency management. Because from those, in order to protect life and community, as well as property, you need to start looking at collaborative efforts and being able to coordinate services. The plan has to be flexible, again, depending on a number of different variables. So you start looking at the size of this document, and it can get pretty excessive. It can get sizable. There's so many different variations in it. But a lot of that, if it's just kept down to the key critical components of what the principles are, and making sure that you're organized and that you have the appropriate coordinations in place, contracts in place, understandings and commitments, maybe mutual agreements. And that's where your emergency manager begins to coordinate all these. They look at the different aspects of how your fire and rescue department might be able to manage, what kind of services can they offer? What kind of training do they have? Do they have mutual aid agreements with local or adjacent communities? And can that help and assist you in mitigating some of the criteria that might happen within your community? Law enforcement agencies. Public safety is provided a great deal of training to handle and manage crisis. It's wonderful if you can lean on them in order to kind of look at their roles and see what kind of expertise they can offer you in trying to guide and manage through this. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to manage a crisis event when it does occur, but also the what happens after that event. What about the cleanup? What about the care? What will happen? What do you initiate for the community members, the citizens? So your public works departments, what roles will they play. The volunteers and organizations within your community. You want to start analyzing and start creating an inventory of these organizations or departments that may have a vital role in taking care of some type of crisis that impacts your community. There's special interest groups. You get Commission on Aging. What about veterans programs, autism programs, mental health counseling, health and human services? All these departments can play a role as it comes into emergency management in trying to coordinate services for the community. When you look at the core functions of emergency management, you start looking at, what's the direction, the control, communication, what kind of warning devices or programs do you have out there? Population protection, how big is the community that you care for? Are you talking a small little community, rural village, or are you talking a larger city with thousands of people and thousands of visitors? So, and you're trying to bring together the logistics of the management in your resources in order to support the overall functions of emergency management. So when you start breaking down into what are the fundamentals with emergency management, you start looking at all the different areas and all the different boxes, and you can begin gathering some of that data from, again, within your own departments. What do your departments have to offer? What kind of businesses do you have? Your manufacturing companies, what do they manufacture, and is any of that possibly utilized or could be utilized in the event of a crisis? What kind of businesses and restaurants in the event you need to take care of some of the primary controls like food and water in service? So you need to analyze your entire community. Sometimes that's better done by a committee than it is by a single individual. One person can begin pulling together data, but it's really a better effort when this is organized as a committee itself, and having representatives of a number of different areas and backgrounds. Because when you look at the overall planning aspect, then you're also looking at what are the aspects of the community warning, what facilities might be utilized in the event of an emergency, such as a school gymnasium, maybe a church soup kitchen, or whether or not they shelter for homeless. What kind of training and who receives that type of training? So when you're looking at your program management of it, a lot of things come into play, and you're looking at the different laws and authorities, not only within your own community, but what are you able to do with assistance from your county emergency management. They're very well versed and very well organized with NIMS and FEMA, and those are very important programs when it comes to emergency management. So are you able to tap into those resources and utilize that and share your inventory with them in order to provide faster, more immediate strength to your local needs? And then also, do you have any programs or mutual agreements with the state emergency management programs? And are you able to access some of those? Some of that comes in with whether it's financial assistance or with programs being provided for cleanups. And then also, are you eligible and have you looked at your access to potential federal funds through FEMA? And how do you gain that access? So preparing all this ahead of time really will save lots of time, lots of lives when a crisis does come in. But a lot of that takes all the planning efforts and again, looking at the business impacts resources that might be needed, and what are the objectives. Once you have all that in place, now you can get into your implementations and looking and testing some of those systems. How often do you test your early warning notifications? Do you utilize radio, television? Do you have audible sirens within the community? Look at all those aspects. And again, if you can lean on your next in line for emergency management, whether that's the county or the state level, their programs can really help guide and develop your programs quicker. You don't have to do this alone. There's no sense in recreating the wheel. A lot of this information is out there already, so it's a matter of tapping into those resources, but you have to do your community assessment first in order to understand what your needs are, what your community needs are. And training and education, not only for your own staff, internal, but what kind of training and education might be provided to your business entities within your community? What about the educational programs? And then even right down to citizens of the community. They play an individual vital role in empowering them to survive a crisis. Really helps with the management of emergency services of any community or any type of business. When you can empower those individuals with the education and the tools necessary for them to survive and maintain themselves, that frees up your hands in order to take care of the more vital aspects of assuring that a community, maybe the water system is offline and needs to be back on. So it frees up your time if you can try to put some of these efforts out into other organizations or individuals' hands so that you can manage the overall crisis for the overall community itself. Being able to exercise and test these, again, the public safety departments, they do this on a regular basis. They're always running drills. If you look at fire and rescue, law enforcement, all of them are always exercising and running tests. And that should be something that the local departments should also be doing, whether it's at a business and for testing their emergency action plans, or just even re-evaluating, talking with the business world about having continuity plans in place, because once a disaster hits, it's very important to get the businesses back up and running as quickly as possible. So the resiliency really needs to be in there. And there's lots of things that the community worlds can do to help with that. One of the things when I was city planner that we would do is we would hold an annual community-wide meeting in the evening hour, and we'd invite everybody for coffee. And we did a lot of different things at that meeting. That was kind of our strategic annual strategic training, planning training for the community. So we could let the community know what we were looking at doing. And then also from our 5-year plan, 6-year plan, what kind of things were on the table for the coming year to be addressed. At the same time, it also gave us a chance to work with individuals and participants that came to those meetings and to share with them information about emergency management. Making sure that they had a plan at home, fire escape routes in their house. Have they thought about that? Have they thought about their meeting location once they evacuate their house? Does everybody in the household know where their meeting location is? So we were able to provide an opportunity during those annual community meetings about emergency management. We're able to talk to the business world as well as at some of the business dinners and meetings about their emergency action plans. talking within the community and just putting out the question, do you have an emergency action plan in place? Do you have a continuity plan in place to be able to bring back your operation, and how quickly? What kind of needs or items would you need from the government side to provide those services? Certainly water, power, natural gas. Those are all items that we know that we have to provide as a support for those businesses in order for them to maintain and to get back up and operating as quickly as possible. So you're looking at all these different aspects of this, but that was something that seemed really well organized and beneficial within our community. We're only a community of about 1,300, so it was kind of a small community, but it was well received, and they were very well organized and prepared. And that certainly helped when we were hit with a tornado one of the years. The community was basically back up in starting to recover within 2 to 3 hours after the tornado passed through. So there were lots of benefits we found from that. So early preventive actions that you can take and educational components you can take within the community really will help in the future parts. You start looking at your different partners, and that's what the basis of our community meetings were about, is we were looking at the faith-based, what kind of organizations, advocacy groups. Like we said, you need to look at Commission on Aging and look at the veterans programs and what kind of special needs in your community from Health and Human Services. So these are all different types of partners that you can rely on and bring in, as well as the county, the state, and the federal partners that you also might be able to bring in. So you're looking at this as a whole community approach to the emergency management, and that really will help with the resilience of the residents as well as the community leaders that are faced trying to bring all this back together. So these are ways that you can look at adding to your organization, adding some strengths, and determine what your assets and capabilities are. So a lot of thought, there hasn't been a lot of thought going into the nonprofit partnerships, as well as sometimes even the private partnerships. Manufacturing, are there different things, whether they're not manufacturing something that's consistent right now, is there something that they can do with their operation to manufacture something that might be vital or helpful to the community? You're not going to know those if you can't sit down and have those discussions openly with them, and just trying to find out and establish, how far can some of this stuff go? How far can you take? Because again, you want to be fluid. You want to be able to be flexible. And the only way you can do that is to make sure that you have other alternatives out there and that you know and understand what those alternatives are. Because your private sector can be very important in helping bring your community back online quickly. And you certainly, as a municipality, want to make sure private sectors certainly do come back online quickly as possible. And so again, having those discussions and those educational groups, business after hour meetings, whatever it might be, for being able to discuss about continuity and disaster recovery plans with the businesses. Because the small mom and pop shop, they sometimes don't put a lot of thought into these types of requirements that they might need in order to get back online. And so they're going to struggle with this. They had a dream, and that was to open and run their business. And so they're only looking at that. So it's helpful if the municipality or the government side can help educate that and sometimes even going into some of the nonprofit sectors, and that could even include some of the educational places. If there's community colleges available in nearby, what can the community college offer as a community course in trying to plan for these types of events, and trying to add skill sets to citizens, to the businesses? You know, are they able to come up with a training course to be able to prepare for these? So if it isn't being done in the local community and you have those community colleges available, is it worth having the discussion with them in order to engage that conversation and maybe see what kind of things can be brought up? You know, there's a ton of different information out there in training accesses from the FEMA, as well as ready.gov and many other agencies. You know, you start looking at, do you have a gymnasium available at a school place? And what would it take to establish an American Red Cross shelter at the school or at a church? You know, it's worth going into and having those discussions with American Red Cross. You know, what are the prerequisites to being able to develop a community shelter where you might live? And engaging in those conversations early and upfront, the quicker you can engage those, the more you can look at what your planning schedule is. And when you start looking at a Gantt schedule, trying to put these in pieces into play so that you're creating this larger puzzle. And then you can look at your overall citizen roles. How do you engage the neighborhood? Do you have community watch programs, neighborhood watch programs? You know, typically these are utilized to watch for threats, whether it be home invasion or some other criminal activity. But can you engage these groups to maybe also think about some of the disaster type components? And can you utilize them to feed resources through them into the neighborhood homes? Being able to develop, assemble emergency supplies, preparing your emergency escape routes in your homes, what to do in the event of a hurricane or a tornado or wildfire. If you have to evacuate, you know, what's the evacuation route? Do you have evacuation bags ready to go? You know, so looking at those different aspects in those areas that we have in our community that we really haven't given a whole lot of thought to. Those citizen groups are there. They're very helpful. They're very vocal. When I worked in city management, it's the one thing I had heard a lot from is some of the neighborhood presidents, if you will, representatives, and they're always open to share those ideas of concerns of what they have or what they feel might benefit their community that they feel that the municipality could possibly help them out with. So it's a two-way street. You can utilize that same type of group and atmosphere to be able to provide direct information into your community residential neighborhoods. You know, being able to sound warnings and alarms, and being able to show them to check on their neighbors, and knowing who the elderly are in the community, and what kind of special needs might your neighbor have. So being able to access and hearing back from that information can go a long ways when you start looking at the overall components of developing your community response plans. So when you're looking at types of response trainings, you know, again, you're looking at the disaster preparedness, and that's on all levels. That shouldn't just be on your governmental departments. That should be engaging the community, the citizens, and empowering them with that same type of knowledge. Because one of the biggest things that would hinder an emergency response is not having your community members and the citizens the ability to be able to respond or act to an emergency, and needing to rely heavily on the local municipality in order for their immediate needs. So there's different areas. If the citizens, whether it's as an individual or as a neighborhood, if there are things that they can do in order to help lighten that load on the municipality to be able to respond, those are benefits that you really want to take advantage of and be able to empower and utilize them. Those community members may also be able to assist Department of Public Works, fire and rescue. So there's many different areas and aspects. So again, when you look at this whole thing, think of this as a community-wide involvement, not just something that one department needs to take care of, or the municipality itself, or one business. If you're at a business, what can you do to engage your employees? What kind of training can you provide them to assist you in trying to bring this back up? We all need to be able to help and be able to be hand in hand in order to survive through many of these types of crises. So again, it's that engagement. You got to be able to bring that up. Maybe some communities utilize CERT as a program. If you're not familiar with that, that's the Community Emergency Response Teams. It's a civilian level training program, usually through your fire and rescue, that teaches civilians and citizens about disaster preparedness for your own individual as well as your neighborhood, basic fire safety training, disaster medical operations, light search and rescue operations, how to shut off your gas line to your house. So it's a very important program and very useful program that I don't think many communities take advantage of to its full extent. FEMA also has independent study courses, and there's a lot of training data out there on the FEMA website. If you've never been to the FEMA website through their educational institute and independent study, it's certainly worth going out there. Easily, there's well over a couple hundred training courses just on their one website. So, additional trainings, again, through your county or your state emergency management agency. And also, as stated earlier, what does your community college have, or what could they offer in training programs in order for responses to emergencies? So there's a lot of different things to take in to consideration and thinking outside the box. There's no one right answer for these. There's good starting points, but you have to be able to develop from those starting points on what fits best for your community. No two communities are the same, so you can't take an emergency plan from one community and integrate that into your community, because your needs are going to be different than theirs. So you can do joint plans, and I've worked on a couple of those to adjacent communities. They're very small. The resources by themselves, they didn't have a whole lot to work with, but we actually worked to be able to put 3 townships that had a couple of villages in each, and actually integrate and make one plan, joint plan for the number of them. So there's there's different areas or different ways to look back at this. Like we said, it's got to be something flexible and something that's workable. So really, you just want to think about how you can work this best for you. So when you're looking at these, you're just not going to be able to eliminate all the risks, but you want to at least be able to identify what risks you are not able to resolve. And once you can identify those risks, now you can look to the other resources that might be available to you, whether it's your county emergency plan, your state plan, maybe a local business, maybe a local nonprofit agency, or even a local school or college. So looking at those aspects, that's what you're trying to do when you're doing your pre-planning for your emergency action plans, is determining what risks are not covered effectively or efficiently within your own current resources, and being able to then concentrate on those and developing those plans. As we continue to talk about this, there's a lot of pre-crisis action that needs to take place if it hasn't already been started. And go back to doing the risk analysis, the threat analysis, and what's the impact of those. So those are all pre-incident activities that should be running, and it's a constant circle on this. So you're always looking at that, you're always engaging in your plan. Your plan should never collect dust. It should always be pulled out, at least if it's not pulled out monthly, quarterly, it should be pulled out at least annually and looked at again. With the plan written, that's where the exercising and the training comes into play. That will show you your strengths and your weaknesses to your plans. So being able to assert those training and exercises, just like we encourage businesses with their emergency action plans. OSHA tells you to make sure that your staff and employee are trained. There's a good reason and purpose for that, that also takes into a larger community base, into your citizens, into your departments. You're looking at the overall, trying to identify those weaknesses within your plan so that you can readdress those, revisit them, bring them back to the committee, find out what needs to be done in order to provide strength or to cover or mitigate those particular aspects. And then once the incident is upon you, if you've ever experienced a natural disaster, it's very mind-boggling. It shakes you up, especially your very first one. When you start going through, it doesn't matter how much training, education you had. The first time you start experiencing that, the horizontal rains or the driving winds, you read about it, but being physically present and going through them is still a shocker and awe. I've been through quite a few different natural disasters, survived all of them, of course. But each time I go through them, I can still feel the awe. So it just never really goes away. It's something that it's hard to grip, wrap your hands around it and understand what it really meant to be in the middle of a tornado or in the middle of a hurricane, and being able to, try to pull your mind back together and concentrate so that you can continue on with your mission and trying to survive through this, make sure there are survivors, protecting property, and trying to get your critical infrastructure back up and going. Because those processes start even in the midst of a disaster. So while the disaster is going on, you're still working on those components and before the post-incident activities continue on. They might be one and the same, but there are items that you are going to work on towards your post incident is going to be going on at the same time as the incident is occurring. So when you're looking at those types of responses and stuff, you have to try to break those down. Again, what's the short terms? What's the long terms? What kind of life-saving devices are needed right now during the incident? And so these are things while the storm is brewing that are going to be racing through your mind, and that you begin to implement out of your plans. I had a much easier one here not real long ago, working through an ice storm that kind of shut down all of northern Michigan. We had our emergency action plans, everything was all in place. Loss of power, how do we take care of that? The one thing we really didn't think about, while we had emergency generators, we talked about fueling. We've got a contract in place for fuel, and we looked at that. Well, we didn't take into consideration that their business was also impacted with that crisis that hit us. And so those shutdowns also shut down their business. And so when I had called them, we're happy to get you fuel if you can figure out how to get it out of the ground. So, we had to jump to a plan B, and that was go deeper into one of my contracts. And so I started having diesel fuel shipped up from 250 miles away. So they were coming, already had the trucks loaded and were coming up here as the disaster was coming to an end in order to continue our fuel supply until we could restore electricity and power throughout northern Michigan. And we were down for a better part of 2 weeks with no power sources. So that was a long time to be able to initiate some of that and trying to get the temporary backup generators in place to some of these power plants and fuel supply locations. So, but it was nice that we were able to engage in that, and we had that ability to be able to do that. But those were some of the weaknesses we discovered in our plan. Is when we looked at our business was testing our emergency reaction plans, we started thinking about that as what other businesses would be impacted by this same type of disaster, tornado, ice storm, because you're not alone. It's not just your building. It's not like a fire. So you do need to think broader and wider on these, and that includes even in your municipal community responses. Remember, when that tornado comes through, sometimes that path is a mile wide. If that cuts through the middle of your community, what kind of businesses will you lose? What type of infrastructure that you planned on utilizing might be impacted by that? So what's your plan B in trying to come up with some of those? Because when you start moving into your recovery aspects, you're going to need to know these. You got to be able to find out what is remaining out of your plans that you had that you're going to be able to work with. And that's where I say it was important to talk with the businesses and the manufacturers in your community to find out more about their operation and how resilient is it, and what kind of variables or alternatives might they be able to offer if they were called upon, if you had to call upon them. So these are important conversations. They're not going to happen overnight. And most of the time, depending on the size of the community, again, my past experience, a lot of these conversations basically took about 1.5 years in order for us to engage in those initial conversations, have follow-up conversations, and start looking at what kind of alternative variations might we be able to rely on or call upon from that particular entity, whether it's a business, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's an educational component. So it's a better part of a year and a half planning to be able to begin gathering all this information. But it helps because, again, you've got to be able to get the economy and the business activity back up and running as quickly as possible. That's the heart of the community in many cities, is the business, whether it's the downtown region. The communities rely heavily on those type of infrastructures and supports. So you've got to be able to restore and improve your own municipal infrastructure. If you supply water, wastewater, electric, Wi-Fi, cable, you need to be able to get those up and restored as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And then being able to bring in your social service networks in order to work with your communities and your assistance livings. You need to possibly come up with alternative housing solutions, temporary housing solutions. So thinking about how can you engage the rest of your community in order to offset some of those tasks that you are faced with. And then always very important, continue the training and exercise. Again, this isn't just at businesses, being able to train your employees on your emergency plans. This training and exercise, this should be right down to the citizens levels, right down to the residentials. Here in my community, fire and rescue, they'll actually go door to door. I've had conversations with the fire and rescue department about first response or emergency response, and whether or not I'm prepared here at the house in order to handle and assist myself while they help those that really need their help and really need because of the life-threatening situation. So engaging and having those conversations up front really will help the overall community, but it has to be done at every level within the community. Citizens being able to talk with the municipal government and municipal management, and being able to talk with some of the education departments, universities, colleges, whether it's even with the churches and homeless shelters. So make sure everybody is engaged. There's a lot of players that can come to the table to be able to help you organize and bring in the planning that you need that is suitable for your community. And this is why it also said, you can't rely and borrow somebody's emergency plan to bring into your community. It has to be made very specific to you. You have special needs that are different from any other community. And so you have to be able to engage in those. Public warning systems is also a huge one. You start looking at that, how will you relay information, vital information, throughout your community? Do you have a PA announcement system? Do you have sirens for early warning? Or are you going to engage, or do you already have something in place to be able to do radio announcements or television channel announcements within your community? So these are many different things that, again, it has to be worked out in advance and identify not just what your primary go-to is, but also alternatives. And then after a crisis has occurred, now you're into the post event. And so public information is going to be extremely crucial at this component. People are going to want to know, where can they go to get information? Where can they go to get services? So your public warning and public information system needs to be out there. is your community's website. Is there a spot on there that is already set up to alert and inform the community of emergency situations? Is that something that should be developed so that if anybody in your community is looking for information following an event or a crisis, can they go to your website to pull down information and know what school or what church to go to for particular incidents? Or if there's someone injured, where can they go? Where's the field medical office locations within your community? How can they find them? So public, and do what you can. Social media is really developing. Maybe social media is a way to be able to put these out there. So again, thinking outside the box and trying to come up with the different variables that would be able to be useful and use them to your advantage. So joint efforts, again, we talk about, you don't have to do this alone. Your community is not out there by itself. If you're a small community, talk with your neighboring communities. What can you do about combining your efforts in your resources and to make a stronger plan? Are you able to utilize those resources back and forth from one another in order to borrow them? So again, it's very important to, at the very beginning stages, develop your inventory list of what you have readily accessible in order to rely or to answer or respond to a particular crisis. And talking anything from generators, talking chainsaws, talking plow trucks, talking, do you have tree services in your community? Again, start pulling together all these different variables, but you still need to go back and identify first, what kind of crisis are you likely faced with, both natural disaster and man-made. And then from that, once you identify those, now that makes it easier to be able to start thinking outside the box, start thinking about those joint efforts and those partnerships. What kind of mutual aid assistant agreements you might need in order to engage that particular aspect of your emergency plans for during the crisis or post-crisis. So these are all different areas in all different efforts to be able to do that. Your joint effort doesn't have to even be completely with your local community, but again, what about your county? Your county governments are well equipped to handle these emergencies. Is that something that could be the joint effort? So what fits best within your community for you and your citizens? So, and again, you can't have just one person doing this. It takes the whole village. And so being able to put together those committee members and identifying who on that committee might be. Do you have someone representing the business side? Do you have somebody representing health and human services? Maybe some of the churches. So think about how you might organize that committee. Some additional information that kind of went along with this a little bit. Again, on the FEMA website, if you go to the emergency management tab and hit that, there is just a ton of information on there about emergency management, about developing those action plans and your resources plans. And then again, community emergency response teams, CERT, you can go to ready.gov. And it explains about the CERT program. It explains how to maybe bring that into your community and how can you get citizens certified in that. Then American Red Cross shelters. Again, do you have a facility that you might be able to utilize within your community or your municipality that you could that might meet the criteria for an American Red Cross shelter. There is a lot of information and a lot of details that goes into a Red Cross shelter. There's a lot of items that has to be present up front before they'll even consider an agreement with you. So take the time to maybe look into that and see where you're at, what are the shortfalls, and whether that's something that could be a reality. And does it make sense to have one in your community? Again, that's the assessments. You've got to be able to do those risk assessments up front. And OSHA, again, they have a lot of emergency action plan checklist for businesses. What can you do about getting that information into your business leaders' hands within your community, and for them to share that with the business after hour meetings, with the DDAs, try to get that information out there. Encourage your business community to make sure that they have an emergency action plan, just like you want to encourage your citizens that they're ready to respond. Many times here in our local community, in October, the fire and rescue departments, they will host Halloween parties. Well, they do that here as a two-part. One, certainly for the kids and being able to get out the candy, but the other aspect is to have that connection with the community. And so they have an opportunity to talk about fire planning, fire prevention, what kind of checklist do you go through? So they take that opportunity to be able to train the community. So are there times or areas or ways that you can expand on that so that it's just not one time a year in October, Fire Prevention Month. Look at what else can be done and when can they do these. And NIMS, National Incident Management Systems, again, that you'll find that under training in the FEMA.gov. And there's a lot of good, valuable resources in there. So a lot of it just depends on what size community do you have, or what kind of size operation do you have, in order to determine what your needs are. And being able to, again, break those down, begin assessing them, develop a risk assessment, as well as your impact assessment. And with that.
All right, so question and answer time. Well, it looks like we've actually run out of time for questions, but if you had a question and it wasn't answered, we will get in touch with you via email to provide a response. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope this presentation has been beneficial for you and your staff. I know myself, it's always good to hear Charles bring up all the good examples that he has in regards to emergency management. And if you missed any portion of this webinar, the link to the recorded webinar will be emailed this afternoon. And then also, as a reminder, our next webinar is October 14th, Emergency Management 301, Counteracting Violence in the Workplace. And the announcement for that webinar will be distributed 1 week prior to the event. All right, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of your week.